welcome to Coast Connections. I'm Elizabeth Hines, and you may wonder why I'm all dressed in black, why I have no bright colors on my back, and why does my appearance seem to have a somber tone? Well, there's a reason for the things that I have on. It's February the 26th, and we're celebrating the birthday of Johnny Cash, who was born in 1932. He would have been 89 years old today. And we're actually going to walk the line to a storage locker in Nanaimo, of all things, to learn all about Johnny's very, very important Canadian connections and Vancouver Island connections. Joining us for this mystery tour is author Julie Chadwick. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me.
And your marvelous book, The Man Who Carried Cash. You finished that book in what year? Was it 2017, Julie?
I came out in 2017, yeah, and I finished it just before that. Yeah, it took about a year, right?
Only 1 year. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a bit of a rush.
We thought on his birthday, we'd bring back the story about Johnny Cash and the Nanaimo storage locker. So take us back to that time, Julie. You were a reporter working for the Nanaimo Daily News, and you got a call to go to a premiere of a movie that had been locally made.
Yeah, so Saul Holiff, the manager's son, Jonathan, contacted me. And, you get a lot of emails of the paper of various stories. People sometimes think that they have these really crucial things that you must know about. And so you always have to weed through and see, what's genuine and what's not. And so at first, when I read his email, it was marked confidential. And I kind of thought, like, is this for real? Like, is there this Nanaimo connection to Johnny Cash? And, he said his father was his manager. And so at first, being a reporter, I was kind of skeptical, and I wanted to kind of like investigate it a little more. And I thought, was he just a friend of his, or was he just sort of peripherally involved? And we decided to relaunch a version of the Harbor City Star and have that as the cover story. And so as I talked to Jonathan, and I went to his mother's apartment condo and looked at some of the materials that they had in this archive, especially this big, like what Saul called his life album, is sort of like a big scrapbook of all the stuff that he thought was kind of most important to him in his life and in his career. And as I was looking through that, I really began to realize like there was so much more to the story, especially the letters. The letters were a huge part of the archive, hundreds of letters. And you could just sort of see in the back and forth, even just in the ones that he had in the book, what an intense relationship they had, like kind of reading between the lines of what they were saying to each other. And I think it was the letters that really gripped me and made me want to look into it more. So Jonathan had done a documentary about his father, and it was launching in Nanaimo. And I realized also, there's certain things you can tell in film really well, like visuals work really well, and there's certain things that work better for books. And so I thought, there's so much more with these letters and stuff that could be made into a book. And so that we eventually kind of talked about it, and he agreed to allow me access to the archive to do a book.
Mm-hmm. That must have been quite the experience to actually pour through that archive of all this amazing history. I mean, Johnny Cash was one of the superstars of music. He had like 43 million records sold. He wrote 400 songs. He had his own TV show. He was a movie star. And Saul Holiff, his manager from London, Ontario, and eventually Vancouver Island, was the one who actually made him a superstar. And that's sort of a little known story, the man behind Johnny Cash, the man who carried cash. And carrying Johnny Cash was a 24/7 job, as your book reveals. There was a lot of ups and downs. And I like the bit in there that is about Saul being an atheist Jewish businessman meets up with this cotton-picking Baptist Southern hellfire of a character named Johnny Cash. The two of them were quite different, but also had many similarities. Tell me a little bit about the sort of the father issues that both of these gentlemen had.
Yeah, I think they both, like a lot of people, like a lot of the story for me was really fascinating because it sort of was about the 1960s. It was about the world of management. It was also about the world of men in that era. A lot of times men weren't encouraged to talk about their feelings. They had, Johnny and Saul would have fights and then kind of quietly reconcile without talking about anything. And so all of this was really kind of emblematic of that era. I think also, you know, a lot of men have issues with their fathers, and Saul and Johnny were no different. Johnny lost a brother early in his life, and his father was often kind of hard on him about it. And, you know, there was these hints of like the good brother had died. And Saul also had like an overbearing father who is kind of always kind of disapproving. And I feel like both men had this feeling that they were trying to live up to something or trying to get sort of an affection and approval that never happened. Yeah, and so maybe the world of show business was one way in which they could sort of try and make something of themselves. And even though they really achieved all of their goals, and Saul really brought him into being, you know, the biggest star of his era, and, you know, the top selling musician of his time, you still get this feeling as you go through the book that they were still tortured. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't enough. Often, as the world of showbiz is, you know, it didn't fill the gaps that they had in their own psyches, and they both struggled separately with their own issues, for sure.
And that's an intriguing part of the story, behind the story, that you've captivated so beautifully in this book, Julie. Take us back to when they actually met. And we're going to go to Newfoundland, actually, first London, Ontario, and then Newfoundland, to talk about the start of their partnership.
Yeah, so they did. Saul arranged a show in Newfoundland, a bunch of shows, and it was in partnership with Field and Stream magazine. And so a bunch of photos were recently discovered from that trip. At the time, I didn't know a ton about it. I talked to Johnny Western, who is a real source in the book, and he recalled like some funny things, like, you know, playing at the Harmon Air Force Base and coming out afterwards and listening to the radio afterwards and listening to a song and thinking, oh, that's going to be a big hit. And so he had some colorful remembrances. They stayed in a cabin and partied a lot, and Johnny bagged a moose. And then just prior to the tour, Saul had renegotiated Johnny's contract with Columbia. So he was really trying to establish himself. Johnny didn't have management at the time. He had just fired his manager, Stu Carnell. And so he was kind of floating and trying to manage himself and not doing too well, as Johnny Western talks about in the book. He was sort of like a bit alarmed at some of the deals Johnny was trying to make on his own behalf. So they went on this tour, and yeah, just prior to that, he renegotiated his contract at Columbia. So he had kind of walked in there and sort of established himself, you know, in the gap that was left by his old manager. He kind of got in there and sort of established himself as the new person who is kind of looking over things. But they kind of unofficially, officially kind of cemented their relationship after that tour. I don't know whether it was just that things went well or that he was impressed with what he did at Columbia, but they kind of just made like a handshake deal at the end of it and wrote down some notes on a yellow legal pad. And that was kind of all they ever really had. It wasn't like a super formal contract, but for Saul, he was always, you know, a real man of his word. And so a handshake deal was as good as a written contract. And, you know, that was it.
And you talk about in your book about, I mean, he was making concert dates all over the world with Johnny Cash.
Right.
And his office was located in London, Ontario during those years. And people would be calling or writing going, is this Ontario, California? Is this London, England?
Yeah.
And you go, no, it's London, Ontario, Canada. So people were quite amazed that this tour promoter and manager is actually based in Canada.
Yeah, and Canada, I found, like, you know, was crucial part of Johnny's career. And it's in the book, you know, I wanted to find a lot. I had a lot of original materials from the archive, but I wanted to, even in the parts that have been written about in biographies, I wanted to find new material and new quotes, you know, about some of the most written about things. And so I went through a lot of Canadian newspapers and found a whole lot of stories that hadn't really been used in any other publications or hadn't been used in any other books about Johnny. And there's a lot of pieces like that Canada kind of comes into, not just him being managed from Canada, but when Johnny got arrested in El Paso, it was kind of a huge blow to his career. And you see in the archives, there's these telegrams canceling his shows, and, you know, it was kind of scandalous.
Canada was very significant, wasn't it, Julie, in many ways to Johnny Cash's successful career?
Yeah, so there was a lot of stuff in the archive that I used that was that was original material, but I also wanted to find more original stuff that I could use that wasn't in other biographies about Johnny. So I went through a lot of Canadian newspapers and magazines and found a whole lot of quotes about shows that he had done in Canada that hadn't been used anywhere else, which was just pretty interesting. And Canada kind of comes up over and over again in Johnny's career. It just sort of surfaces as this significant place. After he got arrested in El Paso, which was quite a scandalous affair. You see in Saul's archive, there's all of these cancellation telegrams coming in because, he had university shows and they were like, we don't want to be associated with Johnny right now. And so Saul really got out on top of it. And, he kind of really shone when these things happened for Johnny. He really kind of worked well under pressure. So he got Johnny in front of a judge and got permission for him to leave the country, and then just did a whole tour in Canada instead, which was really successful and kind of at that point kind of helped save his career to be able to have those other dates. So it kind of it comes up a lot. There was a CBC producer, Stan Jacobson, who did a show about Johnny called The Legend of Johnny Cash, and many see that as kind of the precursor to his Johnny Cash show that was on TV, which really catapulted him into superstardom. And so, yeah, it just kind of comes up over and over, not just that he was managed from Canada, but just that there was a lot of significant moments in his career, good and bad, that happened. He also kind of had a dramatic overdose in Toronto that I write about in the book that was sort of a shocking thing for me in the archive.
He had actually had 7 arrests in 7 years, all due to his addiction and drinking issues. The man was tortured with his addiction. And this was during the 50s and 60s where there just wasn't the help available for him. And he, was on the brink of death a few times with his overdoses. And Saul was there to always, clean up the mess, if it was legally or physically. This man had a really horrible, horrible addiction problem. And part of his relationship with Saul actually brought him to the point where he could be sobered up. And a key part of that, Julie, let's talk a little bit about June Carter Cash, how she came to be part of the show. And in your archives, we've got a lovely little clip here where Johnny's talking to a radio announcer about when June was actually introduced to the band.
In late 61, we played the Big D in Dallas, Texas. And my manager at that time, Saul Holiff, said, we need a girl singer on the show tonight. They want more than just you and your band. I said, we'll get one. He said, what do you think about June Carter? And I said, I've always been a fan of hers. And I had, I loved her work. She really entertained me. I said, get her if you can. So we booked June Carter on the Big D, Dallas, and then that night, she did such a great job. My manager asked her if she'd work the next tour with us, so she did.
So with that was a very historic moment because when June entered the picture, things did change a fair bit for Johnny. And in what significant way do you think June played in his life? Obviously, they got married later in life, but...
Yeah, so the show at the Big D in Dallas I always thought that was a really cool little scene that probably would have worked well in Walk the Line, where, 5 years earlier, he had seen her backstage at the Grand Ole Opry and famously told her, I'm going to marry you one day. And so here was his chance to kind of see her again. And after the show, they had a tour date in Oklahoma City. And so they had to drive there, and there was, a bunch of them all ready to pile in the car. And June went and asked Marshall Grant if she could get a ride. And Marshall was kind of like, oh, I don't know if she can fit in the car with all these guys. And Johnny was like, oh, she could come sit on my lap. And so they're driving to this date, and the snow starts falling, and they end up kind of caught in this snowstorm. And I always just thought it was kind of like a romantic scene, and it was a shame that they didn't have it in the movie. I don't know if it was known about at the time, but and their show got canceled, and so that was kind of, that was sort of a pivotal moment, I guess, in their relationship. I think Arguably, like another piece of the archive that I found really poignant was this 10-page letter that Johnny wrote to Saul in 1967 at what I would consider his rock bottom. He was in the midst of probably the worst part of his addiction. And he talked about how June, after this tour that they were doing at the time, June had threatened to leave him. Essentially, she just couldn't handle the chaos of his addiction. And, you know, his divorce from his first wife, Vivian, was just about to be finalized. And he was writing to Saul, like crying and, you know, saying, like, I don't know what to do. I've given up everything, and I've given up a wife and 4 kids. And here, you know, just as we're going to be able to be together, she's going to leave me. And I would say, like, in my opinion, it seems like that was possibly like one of the things that caused him to go straight. You know, the fear of losing her. So, and there's all of this stuff in the archives that's quite interesting, where there's this like triangulation between her and Saul and Johnny, and you know, Johnny would often agree to things and then forget, and so Saul would bring June in to kind of witness their conversations. And there's lots of letters where, you know, Johnny's written something to Saul and says passes on to June, and like it's just kind of a funny relationship they all had. Saul also managed June, which was interesting for me as well. Lots of like cute letters between the two of them as well.
So a lot of really personal and poignant articles were in that archive, that a very extensive archive. And one of the other quite staggering was Johnny Cash and the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I did a bunch of research into like the era of the 1960s, and so I mentioned earlier his arrest in El Paso. So at that time he had an arraignment, so he had to go to court, and he kind of reconciled with Vivian and flew home to be with her, and she came with him to his arraignment. And as they were leaving the courthouse, an Associated Press photographer took their photo, and it was reprinted in a right-wing magazine called The Thunderbolt, which a lot of KKK members read. And it said, you know, Johnny is found to have this black wife, and which wasn't true. I think she was Italian. But the KKK really seized on that, and over a period of 2 years, and this was when Johnny was really not doing very well. He was in bad health. He was really in the midst of such intense addiction. He was missing shows. He was missing whole tours. So they really went on the attack. And initially, they didn't really get out in front of the article too much, because they just kind of thought like, oh, whatever, you know, it's just silly, right? But yeah, they really seized upon that. And they were, you know, there was, as Saul said, there was white hooded crazies like barricading their shows and putting out flyers. And one person that one of his shows spit in his face. And so when I looked at the KKK in America in the 1960s, I was really shocked at how powerful they were. They were really a force to be reckoned with. You know, these days we often, especially in Canada, we kind of view them as a bit of a fringy group, but you know, back then it was pretty scary. They were killing people, they were murdering people, and like, you know, burning effigies, and like they were really active. So that was
they're also threatening to bomb and blow up any venues that Johnny Cash played in as well.
Yeah.
All because of the conception that he was married to a black woman. So you've captured that really, really well in the book. I really, we just have to move on here, Julie, but I just want to go into a little bit about the relationship again with the Saul and Johnny. And you've provided us with a really interesting audio clip here. It's 1 minute and 7 seconds about the two of them talking about a film that Johnny wanted to produce and did actually in Israel.
Now, there's a couple of things I want to say to you that I need to clear the air completely with you on. Mm-hmm. First of all, I knew way before I even did the film that there's a lot of people, maybe the majority of the people, are not going to buy what I'm saying in this film or what the film is saying. So you see, I don't really have to be told that, because I know that.
Well, when I make a statement like that, that's what is known as trying to be honest, because first of all, if you take 100 people, 25 of them are Christian faith and 20 of them are Muslims, and 10, you know, that's what I meant.
Yeah, well, but I knew that originally, see.
Yeah.
Well, I just felt like that you didn't have a lot of interest in this film.
I'm one of the few people that try to say to you exactly what they think without meaning to be harmful. I'm not trying to break things down. I'm just trying to maybe temper things a little bit by saying not exactly what people think you want to hear.
Yeah, right.
I find a lot of people tell you exactly what you want to hear.
Yeah, I know that. I don't need that either.
And that doesn't help.
No, it does.
You can sort of see the respect there, yet the butting heads. There was definitely mutual respect there. And we just showed a picture too of Saul Holiff actually carrying cash. He had a briefcase full of cash there with maple leaves on his briefcase.
Yeah, so in that conversation, they were talking about a gospel road, which was about the life of Jesus. So after Johnny got through the worst of his addiction, he really, and this happens with a lot of people in the midst of addiction, he really turned to religion as a guiding force in his life. And he really wanted it to be part of his career, which was difficult for Saul as a manager because he just didn't really see how it could work commercially. And so in that conversation, you can really hear him sort of like trying to gently say to him, like, you know, I'm not really sure like how this can work. And crucially, he's saying, you know, I don't want to just be a yes man. I don't want to be the person who just who won't tell you the truth and who won't tell you like it is, because this is something that happens to a lot of musicians and artists when they get successful, is that they get a lot of yes men around them who just kind of approve all of their ideas or tell them, yes, all of this is great. And you need that critical voice, right? Like we see that with a lot of people where they just start kind of making bad decisions and no one has the confidence to just tell them like, no, that's not going to work. And so you can kind of see Saul in that role, or trying to be in that role where, you know, he has to walk the line of this kind of fine balance between both kind of working for Johnny and doing what he wants to do, but then at the same time saying like, look, I don't think this is necessarily going to work, or this might not be commercially successful, or, you know, some people might like this and other people might kind of not be into it. And, you know, you have a lot of fans from a lot of different walks of life. And yeah, so it was always a very tricky job for Saul.
Yeah. And Julie, Saul managed him for 13 years, 13 tumultuous, successful, very, very interesting years. But then it was at that juncture that they decided that Johnny would probably be better with a different manager. And Saul ended up moving out to Victoria eventually, where he lived with his wife, Barbara. And he actually got an honorary degree in history from UVic. As a very mature student, he was in his 50s when he went back to school. It was a lifelong dream of his. Again, sort of seeking, he was looking to, have a little more time for himself in his life and time for self-reflection and spend some time with his sons as well. And he ended up then moving to Nanaimo, the two of them did. And that's where Saul passed away. And you chronicled that very well in your book about his death on his own terms. And that's where how the storage locker came to be found here in Nanaimo. So how was that for you, going through those materials and seeing those gold records and things like that? That must have been a very, very surreal and moving experience for you.
I think the parts that were really moving was Saul left significant audio diary. So it was like 60 plus hours of all kinds of different accounts of things that were happening. And what was really neat about that was that he was often recording as things happened or a month later. And that's really different than a lot of biographies where you have people trying to remember what happened 30 years later when they're being interviewed. So for him, it was almost like a therapeutic exercise. He'd go into his office and he'd fix a drink and he'd just kind of talk into his, I almost wonder if he used it like a therapist kind of, and you can kind of hear like the ice in his drink clinking as he's talking. And of course, like, as we've discussed, he had such a stressful time managing him. And so that was really poignant, like hearing someone's voice, sort of through the earphones over the decades. And I think also the other thing that was really moving for me was just when you take out, the famousness of Johnny Cash, this really is a story about a relationship between two men over quite a long period of time through some really intense circumstances. And that was something that I really enjoyed exploring, which was just how those intense circumstances can affect people's relationship, and how, like I said before, they had these conflicts and then they would reconcile. And the way that some of the early letters between the two of them were quite affectionate. They had these little nicknames for each other, and Saul would sometimes give him definitions of certain words that he didn't know, or yeah, and there was a real affection there, even though like managing someone is generally quite difficult at times, but managing someone who is really in the throes of a chaotic addiction is like even crazier. But all the same, they still stayed kind of bonded through that time. So that was really.
They did stay bonded after Saul finished managing him as well. Saul and his family visited Johnny and June at their place in Jamaica. They had some family trips together there. So they really came to understand each other in a different way after they retired. And I just want to pull a couple of things from your book. When Johnny was asked about Saul, he said, "I only really had one manager who could manage me, and that was Saul." And then Saul said, and when he was asked about Johnny, when he passed away, he says, "He was difficult and endearing, and we had endless conflict." And I just think it's very cool that they were able to maintain their relationship despite of, or maybe because of, these endless conflicts. It really made bridges and gaps for them, which were filled with various other interests.
And lots of really interesting letters later in their life. They had these letters where they went back and forth and talked a lot about religion. I found those fascinating. The other thing that's really neat is the UVic connection. So Saul didn't only go there, but UVic actually acquired his archive, which is open to the public now. I don't know what their COVID restrictions are, but yeah, it's actually open for people to go and see and like listen to the audio and look at the photos. And so that's really neat.
That is really neat. That wonderful piece of Canadian history and world history has been taken from the storage locker and beautifully archived there at UVic. Julie, any closing thoughts for you? We've just got a few seconds here to wrap up.
Yeah, just that the two men just really had such a fascinating relationship, and I think the thing that also stuck out for me was just Saul himself was such an interesting character. I think, you don't always know going into a book. Like I had the star power of Johnny Cash and the interest of him, but that's something that really surprised me as I went along, was just, wow, like Saul himself was just such a fascinating figure, so well read, and his letters are written in such a fascinating way. He was so eloquent, and he had such an eloquent way of describing what was going on around him. Even just his early life before he met Johnny was really fascinating. So yeah, that's the piece that I was really grateful for about the book, was that both men were equally kind of like a force to be reckoned with, and we're both like equally interesting.
Very nice. And you've captured it so beautifully in your book, Julie. Thank you so much for doing that. It's a really important piece of history. And I understand that Saul's son, Jonathan, who still lives in Victoria, is producing a new movie about that moose hunt in Newfoundland, where Johnny bagged the moose. And for our viewers, it's important to know he not only bagged the moose, he had it carved up and shipped to his house in California to use. It was only one moose. Having been brought up sort of with that lifestyle, he knew the importance of respect to animals, and they grew up hunting and fishing his whole life. So a lot of really important that you beautifully captured in your book here, Julie. Thank you so much for joining us today on Coast Connections, and good luck to you for your next book. We look forward to that as well.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us on this episode with the one and only, the man in black, Johnny Cash, on his birthday today, February the 26th. We hope to see you next time on Coast Connections.